Please use our 3 C's. Consent, communication, cognitive thought, otherwise known as critical and creative thinking or decision making. It's currently June 2013. The earth and its human animals, seeds, plants, are under the most catastrophic pressures and enlightenment thresholds in recorded history. One of the most important and simple changes that anyone in the colonized regions of the world can actively do to swing the proverbial pendulum in the favor of quality existence is the small language usage of we instead of us and them. Inclusion and anonymity, as well as separation and responsibility, can be conceptually and practically challenging, but have become paralytic within the unrealistic framework of us and them patterns. As we get more comfortable with the we language change, then we get into the thought patterns, and when we have self-talk and conversations with others, it starts to have an impact that likens us to be the change that we want to see in the world. So basically the communication thing can be wrapped up in a few external resources. There's a 3-hour video that's out there of a seminar. It's Marshall Rosenberg. It's Nonviolent Communication, NVC. There's also a book. It's also a free book, I believe, online. And spend that 3 hours of time. There's also a book by Town and Adler, Looking In, Looking Out. This is 3rd grade communication stuff. When we talk about colonization, colonialization, this colonization process should not be confused with the actual colonization process. This is what we're talking about is colonialism, which is also known as Western culture. Basically, the way that it's been done in this particular part through history is colonial. And so colonial is created colonies. They're called colonies by title. Colonies otherwise would be like bee colonies or hive-mindedness, which the hive-mindedness, the phenomenon itself, and it's where we program ourselves, culturally and individually, sociologically. So we as a species, we trigger myopia, which is a mental process that human beings succumb to. Now, in one respect, this gives us an allowance to focus and to indulge and to share. So there's a good component to this, but much like Western culture calls Kundalini syndrome, we've got a negative twist to our language that needs to be, and needs and haves and wants. These are all Babylon barriers that are perpetuated by the hive-mindedness component, but specifically the colonization. Now this is from an American perspective. Okay, this bit starts off. This is from an American perspective. Okay, right there we can see America is actually the whole Western Hemisphere. So in the United States of America, the US of A, we've adopted the terminology or the label that we are Americans. And really, we don't consider any other Americans to be Americans, even though this is this myopic behavior. Now, technically, the United States of America has never been named. Okay, so this is from an American perspective, a citizen of the United States of America perspective, which, if you want to look at it one way, it's we're us and everyone else is them. So it ties in loosely here with the topic. Now, in a broader stroke, regardless of the accuracy or inaccuracy of the history that we've been taught, we were colonized. Of course, as we realize this, we realize that many regions all over the world were colonized or colonialized, or have been, say, over the last couple hundred years. 400. 600. At any rate.
So it's not incidental that
This is one of the areas where we start to have a real understanding of global citizenry, our impact, the internet's impact, the impact of history, the impact of the future, and how we understand all those things combined. One of the things that's incorporated in this colonization, now there may be some grand things. We have probably opened up the information age by having a standard of education that is previously unknown as far as we know. However, the type, style, length, and focus of this colonized education has many other aspects to it that oftentimes, and most times, the education itself prohibits the learning of the analyzation of the education process itself. So it's a catch-22. And so here in America, we have a standard requirement, a legal requirement of 12 years of formal education.
which, by the way, is considered socialist because it's free education 12 years, and communist because it's forced education for 12 years, and capitalist because we figured out how to make money with it.
And the social prescription is followed by a 4-year college education. That's the average, and that's the norm, and that's the desired. Now, the 14 years, 12, 14, 16 years of education seems phenomenal on one level, in that aspect that it's grand, and its knowledge is power. But if we do anything consecutively for more than 10 years, and if we impose it on other people or other things or ourselves, which is what we do, we impose ourselves into this education system on this grand scale. But 10 years or more of anything is complete indoctrination. 5 years or more, 3 years, 6 months, 3 months of something can be an indoctrination process. So we have to be very, very aware of
Not only the fact that we're programming ourselves to be programmed, and that we are, in one sense, on the communism tip, as it were, that we're all it's uniform. We've all got a standard base with which to work from, so we think, and we do in certain areas, but to also recognize that the foundation is lacking and essential. We're out here, we're all out here together, being basically dysfunctional. There's a lot of missing building blocks that are essential. So add to that things like our individual body clocks and kind of life paths are at different paces and different rates, being another complexity that's not taken into account with an industrialized education system. We can see how some coping mechanisms would probably be necessary, and maybe we shouldn't call them standardizations, but that's what we're kind of calling them now, and I think what we're going for, although it's going to look different and certainly feel different. Here we want to mention too, everybody's at a different juncture on the same path in more of a web fashion, as this audio video series lends itself to, starts to be an example of broadening and exploring this less linear, less myopic, more full and beautiful perspective that we have available.
Now, once we start thinking about we as children, we can see that we knew more as children than we give ourselves credit for. That much of what we knew, and much of what we know now, and much of what our parents knew when we were children, So let's go the whole gamut. And what we know globally, right? Or even consciously, intergalactically, or what we might know as the knowledge fountain, the fountain of knowledge, is squashed by this indoctrination, because that's the process of indoctrination. It's just we go into where there's ultimate truths, or the concept of things that are constant. You can have an opinion about indoctrination, but it is what it is. It's a fact. Now, this is on the bucket list of what we do not talk about in our society, nevertheless, in school. Now, if we were to be given this information initially, give ourselves this information and our children, because they are the ones in this position now on a time scale. We are ourselves trapped in what might be proverbially called the rat race. There's a phrase that parents are in a child's life because a child doesn't know what's best for them. A parent is supposed to know what is best for a child. Well, we could go into a bunch of different stuff about that, but something that we know as children may not be what's best for us that we know, but we do know what's worst for us. Given several options, even without a formal education for critical thinking or decision-making processes, we know what's worse for us. So somewhere along the line, we can stick this in. We can stick it in formally, probably because that's how we're kind of textbook trained now. So in order to go around to a new way, we're probably going to have to go through the textbook way, which we already are familiar with, in order to get to that new way. And that's okay, as long as we recognize the scope, the larger scope of what we're doing, that we live on a global scale now, probably on, here again, a galactic level.
And that we are programmable, and that we can program ourselves. And that if we give ourselves that opportunity, particularly very early in life, to learn that, to understand that, and to have some tools and techniques to work through that, that we will be opening the door to an amazing new reality.
Now, the other thing that happens with this institutionalized, colonized, colonialized, formal education, it feeds our egos. It taps into our pride, our self-esteem, our self-efficacy, and other things. Basically, as humans, if we do this much of something, we spend this much time doing something, and energy, and mental work for so many hours a day, for so many years, year after year, our pride gets involved. And we want to say, by the end of it all, we want to say, we are the smartest people in the world now. That you must know enough for all that time and energy and years that you were, that you did this. But basically, we get conceited. Okay, so, but we, and I want to say you because that's how we normally talk about it, but when we do this to ourselves, we're messing with ourselves with the banking hours, we're messing with ourselves in the annual aspects, yearly, multiple yearly, and we're messing with ourselves in the intensity and the longevity. Many people do find that and many of us have memories of things that we thought were missing.
Or more so that by going to school we were going to learn certain things, and realizing that nobody quite ever got around to the things that we thought were going to be available to us through that scenario.
That seemed so essential, and seem so essential, and are so essential, interestingly enough. But we don't want to say so, because this is what we grew up on. This is our culture, as it would be. This is our indoctrination. We're proud of it. We're proud to have graduated. We're proud to be able to say that we can know all this stuff, and that our brains can expand, and that we're gonna do great things with it. Or maybe that we're unsatisfied with it, and that it seems like something else is out there, and why aren't we getting that while we're there in that environment? Why are so many things missing? We have to teach ourselves, and to say have, it's a pleasure. We we are probably unteaching ourselves this process. So it may very well be like a first language that we've unlearned. And we need to unschool ourselves, as some people say, in a language that doesn't do justice to our understanding of our own personal history. So let's call it maybe an evaluative process. An evaluative process can be taught in decision making, logic, critical thinking, creative thinking, of course, processes that can use math and words, more of a formulaic, prescriptive towards choice and how we move through the world here. At the point that these processes come into play, which we can teach ourselves how to recognize the gaps, shall we say, the blank spaces, the escape from the myopia. Now, one example would be traditional 12-year formal education includes mathematics and English reading and writing the entire year, every year. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the annual cycle, summer break is 3 months approximately, depending upon what state you're in. So not all year, all school year. What is not covered in what one would think would be a very obvious contrast is verbal communication. Verbal communication skills for the majority of Americans are not taught unless it is an elective class in college. Now, this is standard. We talk to people every day. We learn how to speak from our parents and our peers. We spend an advanced amount of time on language skills in every other area, maybe not every other, but in these two particular areas. Math being a language, math being another subject, altogether, which brings up 2 points. Math is a language. It is not separate. It is not, and neither are any of the other. The separate subject curriculum basis for American education, where math class is separate than science class, is separate from physical education class, is separate from recess, is separate from lunch, is separate from... None of that is true. It's all together. We live life as a whole when we eat, and when we study nutrition and the environment, and when we see things in the world that break down into mathematical patterns, when we express or try to communicate our emotions, our thoughts, our situations, we use verbal skills. Whether we know it or not, our ego is the one that tells us that, well, since we've been in school for this long, of course we know how to talk to each other. We do it every day. We do it all the time. And we don't need to study it because it's already a constant. Now, of course, this is a myth. We could use some very interesting examples of this, but this is a myth. We pattern language behavior mostly through our environment and what we're in, who we're with, how they talk. And then, of course, now in the 21st century, we're heavily influenced by media. So if the movies don't show people who are communicating well, then we don't really... We mimic. We have a tendency to mimic because of this programming situation. And it's really, I mean, there's one part of it that's just devastating. I mean, when you really start to grasp this, but particularly on a global citizen level, this is devastating to not be able to communicate to each other. Now, of course, this has a name, and it's called Babylon. Now, of course, that's not the only thing that is called Babylon, but it is one of the uses for Babylon, is the language barrier. And not only the language barrier, but the communication barrier, even within languages or within dialects or even within regions. And obviously, to our own experience, even within families and our own personal expression, such as through art and music and poetry, being well received in all types of manner. So we see that this is a gap in our in our education system, well, let's stick it in there. Let's just put it in there and get it dealt with, and let's see how it goes. And maybe let's back off a year on the math, and back off a couple years on the written English, and see where it takes us. Maybe we'll be able to put it all together without 12 years of all these such things a little bit better. Which brings us to the larger scope of this kind of schedule. Of course, now we've told ourselves, we've told ourselves that we've done studies. We know that early learning is very important. We also, many of us, have early memories of our learning. For example, numbers and letters in other languages are sometimes introduced within the first, second grade, third maybe, and the retention of those is remarkable. Many people that have learned another language in those formative years have retained it, miraculously. Many dual language households are evidence to this, as well as some school systems in America and abroad, and throughout history, for that matter. I'm not sure that we've come ahead by only learning one language in English schools or in American schools. That language being called English, of course, confusion. Within that, we come from a multicultural place. Technically, every one of us should have a second language that was brought down through our generations as a tool and a skill, if not for heritage. Now, of course, there's other theories for this. The war mentality comes in here, and that we look at, here's something that brings in the whole other story of history within our formal education system in America. The devastational genocide of the American Indian cut off many, many, many people from their language and their culture, and that was actually intentional. From what we understand, that was actually intentional because it's part of the programming process. If you can kill all of the adults and teach all of the children what you want them to know, then of course that's what will prevail. That will be the leading and now generations later, we're all in that trap, or that caught in that wave, perhaps. Maybe it's not a trap, but it's certainly where we've been. And with the internet here again, we have the ability to usurp and surpass this phenomenon. So now we can look at that and say, this is an indicator that we can go in an almost opposite direction. And in this case, education, if we go in a counter effect, basically, so maybe we make up a program that's very intensive and covers what we all think it should have, and we say that maybe it's a best practice that it's completed by age 8 or 7 or 9 based on behavior and situation. We ourselves as children, or we as ourselves as adults, or whatever mix thereof, start to recognize these changes, then we can make accommodations because, of course, we're aware of this process that we're doing. Now, this is still not the story of math, which we're going to get to later, but math is a good example for another thing that deserves covering a little bit. It's another human component similar to ego. It taps into, let's call it disdain. The intensity that I mentioned before breeds some very disdainful feelings about subjects like math and science and health and physical education and not just the industrial school complex that we've created here by the end of the 20th century. The fever to which many, many generations now disdain math is a prime example that it's probably not being taught right or used right or understood properly or communicated effectively. Which brings us back to this communication issue here. Communication in the formative years is a blessing. Communication for an entire lifetime is a blessing. Numbers is one of those things that you can see as a universal language, as we can use as a universal language. there it changes though. When your mind can say, well, maybe I can see it being used that way, from where you can say, we can use it this way. Why are we not using it this way? It's so obvious. Now that I've looked at it, this is the process that we're trying to trigger here. Now that we've looked at it, gathered information on it, reflected on it, sought input, waited a certain amount of time to establish levels of certainty, readdressed, initiated, of course, and readdressed again, and so on, to come up with a forward-moving, productive, healthy, sane, safe situation. At some point, we realize that even speaking like I'm speaking now is a linear process. And if you know anything about editing, you'll understand how this is put together in a linear fashion. So at this point, there's several topics that are on the table, and we've got to get to all of them. Now, the fortunate thing about the internet as well is that we can split these things up. I can do several videos, audio, and label them individually, and then in a networking sort of way, or a spider web kind of way, we can all find which ones and go to individual ones that we choose and what order we should go in. Now, typically there's human behavior involved in that. One thing that's a technique that's used, particularly on the internet, is that you shouldn't let a computer user, which is we, I guess, migrate away from the page or the task. Now, this is comparable to our real life in other aspects, not just on the computer, but it's a technique that's used wherein we have to have the self-control to supersede that event occurring. And one of the things that I encourage is that as you watch or listen to something for an extended amount of time, you should pause it and review it mentally, if not replay it, and for reflection, which is an often forgotten part of decision making, and like, say, content debriefing or information gathering, especially when it's high content, or unfamiliar topics. But now this contradicts both of these strategies I've just talked about, which are actually beneficial to our own self-control and our own learning curve, are techniques that can be evasive if we're not paying attention. These are little tricks that we can learn, we can know they're out there, we can adjust our behavior, and we can do it a different way from here on out, simply because we've recognized that one is worse for us than the other. We can still tap into this on some level, and we always have been, we always will be able to, we believe, and touching that or recognizing that is essential for this lifelong birthing process. Remembering that or holding that with us as we grow up, which may be a better imagery to set on it than we do now. Of course, that we've talked about children and we haven't talked about breeding, which is a whole nother discussion. Of course, every time I bring up these other discussions, I have to giggle because some of them are just, they're out there, that these things are all not talked about in our society. They're on the taboo list, which means they're on the bucket list. And so here it brings me to this, the next topics that need to be talked about. Compersion, I have to mention it because it's a necessary word for our vocabulary, whether it fits into the conversation right now or not. Compersion. And we've got money versus math, and circumcision, formerly known as genital mutilation, most assuredly lends it towards being at the top of the list of discussions. Now, of course, money, when we break that down, that's a whole adventure that really needs about, less than 5 minutes.
Because really right now it's a bait and switch for the global water situation that we really need to talk about.
But because everybody in current culture is so wrapped up in it, it needs about 20, hopefully, not more than that. This is another activity that we can spend when we spend time. We spend time and energy like money. And I forget to say this sometimes because I've integrated it over a couple decades. But it's something that we need to unschool. It's go back with our body clock and realize that this is a change that we can make and that it serves our purposes for a better life, better quality of life.